Marvel Rivals is proving that superhero fatigue isn't exactly as big a deal as people thought it was. Remember James Gunn saying that superhero fatigue wasn't really the problem. Audiences weren't tired of superheroes, they were tired of underwhelming superhero movies. Audiences love heroes. Look at Daredevil Born Again and The Penguin. The new Superman trailer has gotten so many views. Deadpool and Wolverine is a massive hit. But the difference is not whether or not they are interested in heroes, it's whether or not they're interested in the stories these heroes are in. By doing the remarkable and making a good game with fantastic art and story direction, Marvel Rivals has gained a massive audience, even undercutting Blizzard's own team shooter game Overwatch in the process. But I'm not a game critic. I'm not here to talk about how the gameplay is fantastic, though it is, nor am I saying how the level design is memorable, though it is. Rather, I want to talk about how the game adapts the Marvel characters for a new medium. Specifically, how does the MCU handle these characters versus how Marvel Rivals handles these characters? And through this comparison, what I hope to do is figure out why the MCU has fallen off in the last couple of years. Though, I'm reasonably confident that a lot of you will probably have the answer already and come to the same conclusions that I've come to on my own. I'm just going to do it in essay format where I talk a lot and get to show off me failing at Marvel Rivals because though I love this game, I will never pretend that I'm good at it. There's a lot of similarities between both Marvel Rivals and the current phases of the MCU in terms of story direction. They're both dealing with the idea of the multiverse and incursions, when two universes collide, resulting in either mutual destruction or a weird entanglement of the two worlds. I think the first multiverse story in comics was the Two Flashes story from DC. However, in terms of Marvel, both seem to draw heavily from the Secret Wars events. Now, there have been multiple storylines called Secret Wars. Secret Wars 2 we're going to ignore because that's kind of like just about the Beyonder being weird. That's not important. The original Secret Wars was a massive crossover in the 80s, mainly to sell toys, where a bunch of superheroes were assembled by the Beyonder, this entity from beyond time and space who mashed up portions of different chunks of the earth and kind of rammed them together, supergluing them in one piece. You had all the heroes, plus Magneto, on one side, and all the villains on the other. And this is where you got a lot of super characters from the comics. Titania from the She-Hulk show, she came from Secret Wars originally. Oh, and by the way, the biggest contribution is, of course, the black suit, because the Clintar symbiote happened to land in Battleworld. Spider-Man needed a new suit, dispensed a costume for himself, turned out to be a symbiote that became one of the most popular characters in comic book history. And Secret Wars ends with Doctor Doom taking the powers of the Beyonder to become the big bad of the event, basically usurping the whole story to become the focus of everything. Years later, Incursions came back in Marvel, and you got the second Secret Wars event. Not Secret Wars 2, but just Secret Wars, the Hickman run. And in this one, all the multiverse kind of collapsed upon itself. It led down to the Ultimate Universe versus the 616 Universe, and Doctor Doom kind of took advantage of the situation from a group called the Beyonders, which is connected to the Beyonder. It's a whole thing. Basically, all you gotta know is that Doctor Doom again usurped the power of the Beyonders to become a god emperor of this new world and created Battleworld out of the fragments of different universes left in the wake of all these convergences. This ended with the universe basically being rebooted, the Ultimate Universe kind of melding with the 616 universe, and it's a whole big thing. And the Fantastic Four disappeared for a long time because Marvel at the time was not publishing the Fantastic Four. Now, if you've been paying attention to the MCU recently, you know they're gearing up for Secret Wars, with Doctor Doom as the big bad. Marvel Rivals does something a little different, however. In Marvel Rivals, Doom and his 2099 counterpart, who is in the comics just Doom displaced in time, so Doom with himself, experiment on the time stream, resulting in time entanglement. Universes mixing and merging together, resulting in a bizarre multiverse where tons of different realities are entangled. Plus you mix in some Spider-Verse stuff, and you got Marvel Rivals. Because Spider-Verse is probably the most successful multiverse story to currently exist. I think Spider-Verse is way better at assembling a multiverse than the MCU because of reasons that will become apparent as we discuss. Basically, everything the MCU doesn't do, Spider-Verse does, and you'll see what I mean as we get there. But yeah, the two commonalities, universes merging and Doctor Doom causing trouble. That's basically it. All these events are essentially excuses to put your favorite heroes together in one space and see them clash it out. On paper, MCU, Rivals, same plot. The differences between them, however, are what makes Marvel Rivals stand out, while the MCU suffers, because it refuses to take risks that Marvel Rivals has to stand out and to draw audiences back in. And I guess the best place to start is with the roster. Yes, the MCU has introduced several characters to audiences, especially as of late, where tons of characters keep getting TV shows and spin-offs, etc. Agatha and Echo have TV shows after all. However, these all seem very siloed in. For a while, the MCU relied on Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor as the core pillars of this world. But Phase 2 introduced the Guardians of the Galaxy and Ant-Man, Phase 3 brought in Black Panther, Spider-Man, Captain Marvel, and the branches of the MCU started to expand. After Phase 3, however, those three pillars have gone in different directions. Captain America is of course gone, and his legacy is being followed up with Sam Wilson. Thor has kind of had a hard time since then, not really having much of an identity following the end of Endgame. And Iron Man, well, yeah, that goes without saying. Though there have been attempts to find a successor in the form of either War Machine or Ironheart, none of these have really cemented themselves as a true replacement for Tony Stark. To the point where Doctor Doom is literally just Robert Downey Jr., I think, in an attempt to fill the void that Iron Man left behind. Come Phase 4 and 5, however, it seems almost like each story is isolated in itself. Never the twain shall meet. There's minimal crossover between these different stories. Phase 4 and 5 has introduced the Eternals, Moon Knight, Ms. Marvel, She-Hulk, Echo, a new Hawkeye, Ironheart, Shang-Chi, Werewolf by Night, Agatha Harkness, Man-Thing, and yet so few of these characters feel connected to the old fabric of the MCU, or even each other. And that's because the MCU is scared to put these characters in stories outside the settings in which they were introduced. The Eternals is only just now, with Captain America Brave New World, being referenced at all. Moon Knight, Shang-Chi, Werewolf by Night, they've only appeared in their first story and nowhere else. They haven't even been referenced. The Eternals got referenced by a name drop occasionally. This Marvel reference is one of them, and What If does all that, but we're not counting What If. That doesn't count in this discussion. Ironically, it's Echo and Agatha Harkness that feel more intertwined with the MCU's story, where Echo references Kingpin and the street-level stuff, references the Hawkeye show, Agatha Harkness references WandaVision and thus Wanda's whole arc, it brings in Wiccan, but even then, they're still very isolated in particular corners of the world. Lesser explored worlds, yes, but still little corners. Honestly, Kingpin feels more like connective tissue for the MCU currently than Kang or Doom does currently. And there's the bigger bads of this world. She-Hulk, Kate Bishop, and Kamala Khan, however, are the closest we currently have to really connecting with the structure. Also Ironheart, because she did appear in Wakanda Forever and now is going to appear in her own show. She's fighting the Hood, a supernatural character, which is, again, connective tissue, but again, that's good. Ironheart, that direction looks interesting because it is connecting different elements of the world, but, it's not enough. She-Hulk started as a Hulk storyline before becoming a legal drama, before incorporating Wong from Doctor Strange, the events from Shang-Chi with Abomination and Wong fighting, a lot of Wong. It brought in references to the X-Men, it brought in references to superheroes outside of the small world of our heroes, and as a result, it became more interesting. It felt more connected. It became a meta-commentary on the MCU. Meanwhile, Hawkeye introduced Kate Bishop, who had connections to both the events of Endgame with Hawkeye, the street-level Netflix stuff with Kingpin, as well as Yelena showing up, connecting her to new characters introduced in Phase 4, the Black Widow world and all that. So again, different elements connected in Hawkeye, but then Hawkeye kind of didn't connect to anything else. Again, Echo draws from Hawkeye, but that's not really the through line we saw. It's just an element connected to street-level stuff, spinning off into another street-level story. The only character who I feel is successfully integrated and gone beyond just her niche is Kamala Khan. who is, I think, one of the best additions of Phase 4 in Marvel, period. To clarify, I mean characters introduced in Phase 4. Among those, Kamala Khan is the only one to really stand out. Yelena might also fit into this, but the Thunderbolts is not out yet, so I can't speak to the quality of that film. She's gone from being in New Jersey, to Pakistan, to space. She's encountered the Kree. She's been connected to the multiverse. She was connected with Nick Fury. She was connected with all these other elements and is tying in with the mutants. So again, Kamala Khan is kind of connected. Oh, and then she met Kate Bishop. So the through line from Hawkeye led into the Marvels. The problem is the Marvels wasn't that great of a movie. I don't think it was bad, but it wasn't great. It was very middle of the road Marvel. And again, the problem is the best part of that movie was, again, Kamala Khan. So it's really tricky because you get these elements connected, but like it doesn't really, you only care about one factor of it. You're not really given enough time to really care about the other characters as much, I think anyway. But let's take a look at the Marvels. By connecting an Agent of Saber, Nick Fury, Captain Marvel herself, Kamala Khan, the bands, the Kree, it connects different elements of the MCU and fuses them into one key idea. Those elements are contradictory. They are contrary to each other. With these contrasting elements, each individual component of the narrative feels more dynamic, and the world building of the MCU as a collective whole is enhanced. And this is even getting the subtext of Captain Marvel and Valkyrie's friendship, we'll call it. But yeah, I personally feel that Kamala Khan's the best part of that, but I digress. Cinematic universes were built on the appeal of combining and mixing different characters from different worlds together. The core of the Avengers, you get to see a tech billionaire, a soldier displaced from time, and a literal god teaming up to fight an alien invasion. That's the core of the story. These different action figures from different toy boxes being put together and fighting. Or, better, interacting. That's the problem. There's very little interaction between these different elements in the MCU currently. And when you do get these interactions, it's usually extremely brief. They're very few outside of the Doctor Strange Wong world where they really connect. Doctor Strange and Wong, I think, are particularly the only elements that really feel connected anymore to the larger MCU, in particular just in Phase 4, where Wong showed up in multiple projects, Doctor Strange's magic tied the plots together, and that felt like the biggest through line throughout. Specifically, the Darkhold remains relevant from WandaVision into Doctor Strange 2. Doctor Strange is necessary for the plot of Spider-Man No Way Home to take place, because it's Doctor Strange's spells that result in all the multiversal shenanigans. Wong shows up in Shang-Chi, Wong shows up in She-Hulk, and all of that kind of ties in this underground fight scene that Wong has gotten himself involved in. And further, Doctor Strange 2 ends with the tease that America Chavez will be training under Doctor Strange, as well as Doctor Strange going off to deal with some multiversal threat. This ties Doctor Strange in with what ultimately will become the Secret Wars event for Marvel, but it does not seem that he's relevant so much in Phase 5, despite being omnipresent in Phase 4. Fortunately, that through line no longer matters because Phase 5 hasn't even referenced Doctor Strange in a long time. He's gone off with his third eye with Cleo to fight Dormammu or whatever. So he hasn't really factored in all that much, and Wong's been quiet since She-Hulk. The closest relevance that Doctor Strange has in Phase 5 is Agatha All Along, mainly because that deals with the fallout of Doctor Strange 2, and Scarlet Witch maybe being dead, who really knows for sure? She's going to be back for the next Avengers film. I'm guaranteeing it right now. I'm calling it now. Now, Wakanda Forever, I think, did a really interesting job weaving different elements of the MCU together to show an interconnected world. But Wakanda Forever was also about Wakanda being introduced into a brand new world, a new setting, a new environment, people trying to exploit Wakanda, getting into a war with Namor, the US government trying to invade it. So again, there are these elements at play here that show Wakanda functioning in a larger world outside of Wakanda, which, given the first movie was about Wakanda leaving its isolationist nature, makes sense, and it is effective storytelling. But again, Wakanda Forever is the exception, not the rule of this phase of the MCU. And to prove this more has a negative impact on the MCU than ever before, look at Marvel Rivals. Marvel Rivals clashes tons of different characters from all over the Marvel Universe, from the iconic to the obscure, and throws them all together. An average Marvel Rivals team can see Hawkeye team up with Venom, Hulk, Squirrel Girl, Loki, and Jeff the Shark. What a strange blend of characters, right? To have all in one team. And for a video game, you just accept it and move on, because, oh, it's the gameplay, it's the mechanics. But really think about that. Those characters teaming up together in one singular event. That would never happen in the MCU. Because these characters are all billion-dollar franchises with actors who are so expensive and all the effects for that and whatever. And it's more costly to do that, so there has to be a big reason to bring them all together. Or, in the case of Venom, Sony hoarding him and preventing him from showing up in Spider-Man and other Marvel properties. I think especially with Venom, we miss out on a lot of opportunities, because Venom isn't just simply a Spider-Man villain, but a hero in his own respect, with ties to the larger Marvel universe. The King in Black event became a massive universe-spanning event, where the Avengers, the X-Men, the Fantastic Four were all brought into it and could do nothing about it. Same with Absolute Carnage. Maximum Carnage even itself was a big crossover event that brought in characters like Cloak and Dagger, Morbius, Captain America, Deathlock, Black Cat. It became a bit of a crisis event in and of itself, and I think Venom's absence from the MCU is a big vacant gap in the world. I discussed in another video the rivalry between Venom and Wolverine and how interesting that was in terms of Venom's development, but even then, modern Venom is so intertwined with the bigger Marvel universe that him not having a presence in the MCU at all by this point, you can feel it. And maybe they're going to bring Venom in soon, I don't know. But the problem is, with every single year Venom doesn't show up in the MCU, there's a wealth of stories that they could be doing that they're just choosing not to do. And that's very disappointing, not just for Spider-Man, but for the larger universe. Plus, I'd love to see Venom and Wolverine fight. And this isn't even taking into account how these characters are interacting and were affected by the time entanglement. Alternate universes, Wakanda becoming an intergalactic empire, New York being overrun by Dracula, Clintar and Null overtaking the spirit of Bast, Loki and Hela taking over Asgard, the Spider-Verse and all that kind of stuff. There's so many interesting elements at play here. And the characters that we meet are not the same characters that we're familiar with. In some cases, they're completely different, like as is the case in the 2099 timeline, with Captain America waking up much, much later, and Black Widow living into the future and reuniting with Cap. There's more elements at play here that make it very interesting. Consider how Marvel Rivals introduces the Fantastic Four. They're introduced fighting Dracula. When has a Fantastic Four ever in any continuity been introduced fighting Dracula? Usually it's Doom, or Galactus, or the Mole Man. Fantastic Four enemies. But by mashing the Fantastic Four with Dracula, it creates an interesting dynamic that's really, really cool, and unusual, and stands apart from what's been done previously. And by tying in Khonshu and Moon Knight into the Dracula story, you also get the added bonus of A, tying Dracula in with another important character with the great cosmology of Marvel, and B, you get to make this meme. You get to post this a lot, actually. Where's my fucking money, Dracula? You big fucking nerd. And Marvel Rivals isn't hiding how it's using these different characters in unique ways. Usually, Venom is introduced tied up with Spider-Man.
Will you be able to put aside our past and trust us on the field of battle, Spider?
I couldn't even trust you to write an accurate news story, Eddie. What's changed?
We have embraced our role as a protector. You should be proud of us.
But in Marvel Rivals, Venom has connection to Spider-Man, is referenced by the Spider People, and has a team-up ability with the other Spider People, but his core enemy is Null. And Null is also the core enemy of the Black Panther Wakanda storyline. So it's very interesting how these elements are weaved together in a way that shows that these villains are not simply one-off threats, but rather overarching presences in the narrative.
There is a dire threat on the horizon.
Yes, I am well aware of Doom's meddling in the time stream.
That pompous fool? Doom is a nut compared to our true enemy. Null is coming.
And also they pit Venom against the Guardians of the Galaxy on the Clintar map, so that's kind of cool. But again, I digress. We'll get to the story more later on and how it's weaved in with everything. We also get variants of established characters that are very interesting. For example, Iron Fist and Psylocke. They aren't Danny Rand or Betsy Braddock or canon. No, those are the version people are familiar with. No, we get Lin Lei and Psy. Different, no, not that Psy. Not you, Psy. This Psy. We get different versions of the established characters than we're used to, and thus, characters from the established world, like Magneto, bump into Psy and go, oh, I know a Psylocke like you. You're not that version. And that contrast and unfamiliarity makes things very interesting.
You look at me as if you know me.
In my timeline, you are one of the greatest warriors our nation has ever known.
I have been seeking others like me.
And once we are done here, I will gladly take you to them, my dear.
To say nothing of characters that are just obscure, like Luna Snow, or Jeff the Shark, or Galacta, but have become household names because everyone playing the game looked up who is Jeff the Shark, who is Luna Snow, who is Galacta, the moment they were tied in with this game. And, let's be honest, Jeff the Shark has now become ingrained in our memory thanks to playing against him and dealing with his ult and, being on the point and then getting sucked into a whirlpool of doom and destruction as Jeff drags you off a cliff into oblivion. I'm not upset. And I do want to point out it's interesting with Marvel Rivals. We get all these variants of established characters when the MCU has done that same thing. But where Marvel Rivals no one seems to care, the MCU introducing variants of characters, everyone gets upset. Great example of this would be Michelle Jones Watson in the MCU replacing Mary Jane Watson. People got really upset and still are upset over the fact that Zendaya is playing the equivalent of MJ, but not quite Mary Jane, the character we know from previous lore.
You have MJ, which was once this great character that helped Peter throughout the years as a girlfriend, then a wife that helped him, was literally the center point of Kraven's last hunt. Now she's Zendaya. I don't think I have to say much more. Zendaya looks like a 12-year-old boy who lives in the slums of Brazil or something. She doesn't look the way Mary Jane Watson should look. Just look at any illustration of the character. John Romita Sr., Todd McFarlane, or the controversial but still great J. Scott Campbell. MJ does not look like Zendaya, and they do everything they can in all three of these movies to separate her from the original character. She's just this ugly bitch going around punching people in the nuts, making smart comments towards everybody in the film. That is not Mary Jane Watson, yet none of the fans called it out.
Look, this is gonna sound racist, but stop.
However, we have a whole new Psylocke. No one cares. I mean, I know this version of Psylocke was introduced in the comics previously, but for general audiences, it's not the version of Psylocke that we're familiar with. Either version of Psylocke that we're familiar with. There is, of course, the misogynoir elements to the Zendaya casting, which deserves to be mentioned, and is a huge factor to all of this. But even then, you would still think there'd be some issue that the usual parties would have with the change in race and ethnicity and identity of the characters. But it seems to be very absent with the gaming side and very present and loud with the film side, almost as if it's a double standard. But, who knows? This is a topic I go into way more detail on in my Forced Diversity video. I don't have the time to recap everything I say there because that video is quite long, but I feel like that video is a good place to go to if you want to hear my thoughts more on this topic. Even Penny Parker is different in some ways, but also familiar. Well, Penny Parker is interesting because Penny Parker is more well-known to general audiences from the Spider-Verse films, but not the version made by Gerard Way of My Chemical Romance. It's a whole thing. I do love the Venom suit. That's really good. I like that little reference to lore. With Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, the show that just came out, there's a new variant of Kurt Connors, who is a woman of color. And some people online have already reacted negatively to that. Even though, in the same breath, At the same time, Marvel Rivals is introducing a new version of Iron Fist, who isn't the white version of Iron Fist that these fans would know. So again, it's interesting how even among the reactionary crowd, the reaction to Marvel Rivals is so different. And I think that speaks to a few things, the most important of which being many of these people don't actually read the comics, but also that this is doing something different enough and establishing a world where all the rules are upended, so any changes are expected. It's a world where change happens. So yeah, they change things. That's the point. But the problem also is that there are characters who typically would end up being front and center, and those who would not, who are now front and center in Marvel Rivals. Jeff the Shark is one of the most widely discussed characters in Marvel Rivals. Yet, Jeff the Shark would never headline a movie for the MCU, but he's given equal measure in the game as Doctor Strange, or Iron Man. It might be hard to remember, but for a while, Iron Man was just a C-tier character. The only reason Marvel made an Iron Man film was because they didn't think that he was worth enough to sell to other studios when they were selling off the rights to their characters during their previous bankruptcy scare. Spider-Man, X-Men, the Fantastic Four, Daredevil, all seen as more valuable assets than Iron Man. The most valuable character at that time was the Hulk, because the Hulk had demonstrated popularity with popular audiences thanks to the success of the 70s TV show and other projects. But Iron Man? And forget Doctor Strange, he was a throwaway gag in Spider-Man 2 at best.
What are we gonna call this guy?
Dr. Octopus.
That's crap.
Science Squid?
Crap.
Doctor Strange.
That's pretty good. But it's taken.
There were even rumors for a while that the lesser characters from Marvel Studios would get like short films. That obviously changed, but it reflects the fact that Marvel for a while was willing to take risks on their lesser known characters. But now, these characters are household names. Characters like Moon Knight and She-Hulk get TV shows, but not film, because they're too much of a risk. And there are other characters too who just haven't appeared in the MCU because they might be silly, like Doctor Strange's Ghost Dog, or Squirrel Girl. At all, just Squirrel Girl. They tried to introduce her, but they cut her out with the New Warriors to cancel that show. Cloak and Dagger had a TV show, never gets mentioned in the MCU properly. These characters were deemed small potatoes, was sidelined, and then forgotten about by the greater Marvel Universe. But in Marvel Rivals, they are again front and center. Because Marvel Rivals is a video game, and games, with their game roster, always want to choose the oddball choices, something unexpected to put a spin on things. If it's too predictable, audiences get kind of bored, they're not excited, they know exactly who's coming next in the game. Oh, we've introduced all these established characters, oh, they gotta introduce Captain Marvel or whatever. Captain Marvel, Carol Danvers has not been included in the roster yet for Marvel Rivals. But Jeff the Shark has. There's no Deadpool, but Cloak and Dagger appear. It's unexpected, it's interesting, it's dynamic, it introduces players to unusual portions of the Marvel Universe. Meanwhile, the MCU introduces all these different characters to show up once and then they just drop them. America Chavez, I bet you forgot she even appeared in the Marvel Universe. Yeah, she appeared in Doctor Strange, didn't show up. The leader from The Incredible Hulk was introduced at the start of the MCU and is only almost 20 years later becoming relevant. That's the problem. These different elements are introduced, linger in the background, and never really tie in unless it's the more tightly written Marvel stuff like Captain America Winter Soldier or Civil War. But the problem is the MCU is introducing so many new things that don't tie into anything else after the fact. It results in everything feeling kind of pointless. Why should I watch this new show if it's not going to connect to the greater world I'm interested in? And because of that, you get overwhelmed. You get bombarded with so much stuff at once. That's why the Spider-Verse also works so well. Each film introduces just enough that you need to understand it, teases you about their world so you follow their background, you know what they're about, and then intermix them into the main plot. There's very little time wasted, you don't feel like you're missing anything, and you can follow along with all these different characters from different universes just as well as if you had watched them a solo film about them previously. The entire prologue to the second Spider-Verse film is just about Gwen Stacy and gives you just enough info that you can follow along just nicely without really needing to dive headlong into her lore or have to do homework to follow it. With Marvel Rivals, though, all the different characters play into the stories they're introduced into. Season 1 and Season 0 are the only seasons out so far, but both have integrated all the core characters into the plot in a way that's interesting and compelling. Season 1 especially mixes up the Avengers with the Fantastic Four, confronting Dracula and Moon Knight's there, and even characters who aren't directly relevant still show up in the plot somewhere to establish a sense that, oh, your favorite character is here and they're doing something. They may not be the main core player, but they're still working together. It feels like the world is connected in a way that's interesting and compelling.
So you're telling me there's a whole multiverse full of spider folk?
I know! Pretty cool, right?
You gotta be kidding me. I can barely tolerate one of them.
This is opposed to the MCU, where in phases 4 and 5, there's no team-up film. There's no real crossover. When Valkyrie shows up in the Marvels, it's only for a little bit. When Wong shows up in everything he's shown up in, he shows in for his scene. Maybe it's in She-Hulk, he has an episode about him, but then he leaves and it's not really relevant after that point. It never feels like these characters exist in long periods of time. Outside of the She-Hulk episode where she meets Daredevil and Daredevil does the walk of shame with quite a big smile on his face. She-Hulk is probably the best at kind of demonstrating the connected universe of the MCU in Phase 4, which is, that's saying something. One of the reasons why Spider-Man No Way Home was so popular, even though it had flaws, what film doesn't, it's that it connected the MCU with Spider-Man, it connected other past worlds with Spider-Man, and wove it in a way where everything felt relevant, and it rewarded you for caring about these characters. The reason why Deadpool and Wolverine was so successful is that even though Blade and Elektra and Gambit, they may not be the stars of the movie, they all felt like they were relevant in the narrative. There were tons of characters that you knew who were coming into play. It rewarded the audience for their devotion. Yes, it is fan service, but sometimes fans need to be serviced. You know what I'm saying? Because it's not just simply, oh, it's just here for superficial fun. It's also, hey, these are characters that you've liked, and here's where their journey is going. And in some cases, as is the case with X-23, with Laura, that culminates in a more compelling, succinct arc for her character. It rewards her arc. It brings it full circle and shows the continuation of her narrative. Fans read comics and watch superheroes to see the ever-growing, ever-changing narrative of these characters and their interactions with other heroes. Heroes in isolation are less compelling than heroes in relation to a world, and the MCU has become increasingly insular. I honestly feel that most of the modern MCU's problems would be solved if they just had a team-up film after Wakanda Forever. Why make Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania? Make that an Avengers 5, Have it be a new team of heroes teaming up against Kang. By putting Kang against Ant-Man and having Kang lose, it makes Kang feel less impressive. Why should the Avengers worry about this guy when the guy who got out-gambit by Spider-Man can beat him, When Loki was the big bad of the Avengers, sure, he had lost to Thor in his previous film, but Loki also almost destroyed a planet and brought ruination to Earth and had all this scheming and mischief. It felt more realistic that he can plan something out. And again, in the Avengers, he was also supported by an army, teasing the bigger threat of Thanos. Kang just gets beaten and that's it. No, he's gonna fight Kang again, but 20 more times. The Loki show did a better show of establishing Kang as a threat, but even then it was more of the threat of a system that needed unraveling. You can still punch Kang out. With Loki, it was more mischievous. It was more, okay, he has a plan, and he's going to misdirect you to go here, but he's really going to do this, and, it's more underhanded tactics. He pitted the Avengers against each other. That was fun stuff. With the MCU recently, there hasn't really been that kind of connection between the characters. There is no Civil War event. There is no Avengers team-up. Every element feels isolated, and thus every element feels blander and blander as a result. Because without the contrast of these colorful characters together, each individual element feels more conforming to the standards of their specific narrative. Meanwhile, Marvel Rivals has these colorful, wild characters together, and the wackiness of the visual contrast between them helps emphasize the conceptualization of how we see these characters. The best entries of the MCU so far have pitted characters in different situations. I will argue Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness is one of the better projects of the MCU, and it also captures the idea of contrast so well. By putting Doctor Strange, Scarlet Witch, Mr. Fantastic, Professor X, Black Bolt, Captain Carter, and the Monica Rambeau Captain Marvel in one space in a fight, it's some of the most visually interesting stuff in the MCU, and it's wacky and it stands out. Yeah, the film isn't as good of a film in terms of narrative structure, but there's something to be said for anything that has Doctor Strange possessing a zombie with an army of ghouls as his cape, combating Scarlet Witch as demons look over her. That stuff is interesting and dynamic, and it also connects different elements of the MCU together. That high contrast results in things being interesting. Marvel Rivals does that as a default. That is the default mode of any game of Marvel Rivals, and it's constant and it's throughout the whole thing. But also, there's the idea of lore. Yeah, the MCU is rough, but previously it was just a few series of movies connected together. If you watch the Iron Man films, if you watch the Thor films, if you watched the Captain America films, you could follow along what's going on pretty well. But now the MCU has sprayed out in so many different directions and become frayed. It's hard to really know what's necessary if you're not watching everything, because what do you watch? Do you watch the movies? Well, now the movies connect to TV shows, but only a couple TV shows, right? It's a lot of content, and people feel like they're doing homework to catch up with what's going on. Versus the comics, where you have hundreds of thousands of issues of stories where 75% of it doesn't matter, and the other 25% only matters sometimes. There's so much you got to know, but you don't know what you have to know if you're unfamiliar with the characters. Marvel Rivals, however, has a solution. Plot and the game are divorced. You can play the game just fine because you're familiar with the idea of the characters. You know generally who Iron Man is. You know generally who Captain America is. You know generally who the Punisher is, etc. But you don't need to know what versions of Captain America they are, what versions of the Punisher they are, but you can learn. The game offers you to read up on the lore and narrative of the game. In fact, it's a reward for succeeding. You get bits and pieces of the lore as they drop. And as a result, that gives you just enough to follow along with the main storyline is. The storyline progresses, but it also doesn't force you to have to play the story to follow the story. You are incentivized to learn more. And as a result, people are actually going to the comics more to learn more about these characters. The Marvel Wiki, on the release of Marvel Rivals, all the obscure characters I mentioned, like Jeff the Shark, Luna Snow, Galacta, they were the most searched for topics on the Marvel Wiki, because people wanted to do more research. The game's structure forced you to learn more. This is unlike the MCU, where they hand you the information. You are not incentivized to learn more about these characters because the MCU gives you a different version of the lore, and your knowledge stops at the films. Marvel Rivals asks you to do more research, but leaves you with just enough where you can go, okay, I want to know more about these characters. I want to find out more. In that sense, it draws more people into the comics than, say, the MCU might, as is the case with a lot of video games. I feel video games are a great entry point for comic book fans, more so than the films, because the games usually start somewhere in the middle of a story and say, okay, there's lore you're missing. You don't really need to know it to follow this, but if you knew it, it will make the game more rewarding, and thus people do more research, they look things up. There's even a Marvel Rivals tie-in comic that I think was more successful at tying in with the lore than, say, any of the various MCU one-shots they used to release back in the day. Mainly because this actually matters in the plot versus the MCU tie-in comics, which maybe get referenced never. So, again, what can the MCU learn from Marvel Rivals? How can Marvel Rivals influence the films in a way that benefits audiences at the end of the day? Well, I think there's a few solutions. One, put the characters together more. The MCU is starting to do this now. Captain America, Brave New World, and the Thunderbolts are putting together characters who may not fit together naturally. And that's good. The contrast helps these characters stand out more and keeps it from becoming too stale and too formulaic. But further, we need more big events with unusual opponents. After Secret Wars, what I hope the MCU does is introduce more Avengers films, more team-up films, where characters can just encounter wild things. There's rumors of a Hulk versus Wolverine movie. Fantastic. We need that. I'd like to see a flashback film where Wolverine shows up with Captain America. That'd be fun. See World War II through their eyes. Maybe they can break Magneto out of a concentration camp. Something interesting like that would be fun to watch because it would show these characters exist in a world that's interesting. DC, I think, is doing this. The Superman is introducing Hawkgirl, Green Lantern, Mr. Terrific, all these different characters together in the Superman film to show the world exists. And through that contrast, it will manage to make the world more colorful and more dynamic as a result. We've already seen this with Creature Commandos, where you have Cersei, you have Dr. Phosphorus, you have all these characters tied in with the greater lore of the DC universe, interacting and mingling together. But I think also what the Marvel Universe needs to understand is that colorful characters succeed. Look at the character designs of Marvel Rivals. These characters are dynamic and interesting, and in some cases have very, very large cake. I do feel like the sexless nature of the MCU currently is something I'm critical of, but I digress. The problem is that Disney wants to make products that are safe and reliable. They don't want to break the formulas established with each individual character, yet in order to make Marvel stand out, you need to mix and muddy everything together. You have to break the formulas and shove and stitch together pieces from different parts of the world together to make things interesting. In short, you need to remember why Battleworld was successful. You need to know why Secret Wars was so successful. It was the opportunity to take all these different siloed parts of the Marvel Universe, smash them, and reassemble them into one world. If the MCU can do that, it will succeed. And if not, well, we still have Marvel Rivals. Before we wrap up, though, I do want to leave you with my pitch for a new character for Marvel Rivals. I know everyone wants Deadpool, everyone wants, all these guys. But, okay, hear me out in this one. Big Bertha from the Great Lakes Avengers. We need more female tanks, and she's interesting, different, unusual, and definitely a lesser-known character. Marvel Rivals, make it happen. Put Big Bertha in Marvel Rivals. I swear to God,